So now it's my pleasure to introduce another one of my colleagues here in the department, Dr. Margaret Jodlowski. Margaret's been here for what, just over a year? Is that right, Margaret? So Margaret came here right in the middle of the pandemic, which was pretty difficult for her, but she's starting to get herself known out in the state and elsewhere. She had a piece discussing labor issues in Ohio's Country Journal over the summer, and last week she appeared on AgriTalk Radio talking about labor issues. So Margaret's getting visibility now, despite the difficulties we've had dealing with all these issues the last 18 months. So Margaret's an assistant professor in our department, and she graduated with a PhD from Cornell University. That's from the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management. And she works on a number of issues, but with a special emphasis on farm labor and farm household dynamics. And today she's going to talk to us about now hiring, an Ohio food and agricultural labor update. So over to you, Margaret, and thanks for being ready to present to us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ian. And it is so good to be here presenting on this very timely and I think very important topic. It's a little daunting to have to give an update on the labor market in this current climate in just 35 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. And of course, as Holly and Ian both said, happy to talk later on any of these issues. And so not to waste any more time, I'm going to get right into it. As an outline for what I'm going to cover today, given that it's the Outlook and Policy Conference, I think first and most importantly is to give an update on the current employment situation in the food and ag value chain across the state, and sometimes relying on some national data as well to inform us about trends in this sector. So I'm going to look at outlook for value chain employment, so employment rates and unemployment rates across the value chain, looking at 3 different parts of the agricultural value chain in particular, just to give us a sense of how the industry is changing and what we can expect over the next couple of years. Also, we know, I think every farm operator in the audience and most people have heard that input costs are rising. So we're also going to do a quick overview of the dynamics in this wages for this value chain as well. So looking at how those wages have sort of responded or are driving some of the changes that we see in the unemployment or employment rate as well. And so I think that will be hopefully very instructive to sort of see how the cost of that input, labor, of course, is changing over time. Throughout, I'm going to be providing a little bit of insight into the causes of this sort of dynamics that we see, as well as a couple theories about what's driving these changes. And hopefully all of this will be very actionable and information that you as an operator or manager can respond to and sort of understand how to respond to these ongoing changes that really don't seem to be showing any signs of letting up. And then, of course, it is the policy conference as well. Just at the end, really quite briefly, going to give an overview of the biggest potential change to the agricultural labor force at the very end, and hopefully give that a good bit of airtime, given that all the other stuff that we have to talk about in terms of employment in agriculture in Ohio. And so, without further ado, I will get right started on the update for employment in the agricultural value chain. And so I guess the first question that people often ask is this phenomenon, this great resignation, whatever you'd like to call it, is it an actual phenomenon? Is it actually something that we observe, or is it just one of those things that the media is sort of glommed onto? It makes for really catchy headlines. These are just 3. I could have put 300 onto the slide, but we all know that we've heard a ton about it in various media outlets sort of for the last 4 to 5 months, especially. And so is it real or is it media hype? It's a little bit of both, but the reality is that the most recent Job Outlook and Labor Turnover Survey, or JOLTS, which I always find a very funny acronym. Reminds me of my cup of coffee in the morning. The latest JOLTS report showed that the 2021 quit rate, August 2021 quit rate, which is the number of people leaving a job, was 2.9%. To put that in perspective, that is the highest quit rate ever recorded since the survey began, since they started publishing or calculating the quit rate. And so, yes, it is getting a lot of attention. It might be overblown to some extent, but the data do seem to indicate that people are leaving their jobs in record numbers. Although that overall 2.9 does sound rather low, it is the highest that we have seen over the last 3 decades. And so with that in our minds, the next question that people often ask is this COVID? Is this pandemic related? Or is this something that had been going on and COVID made worse? Or had we been trending up in employment? Had everything been looking really peachy keen and then COVID came and switched everything up? And this is going to be an unsatisfying answer, but the reality is that it does depend. First, it's heavily sector dependent. And so it's even impossible to make general statements about the food and agriculture sector. So it's important, and that's what I'm going to do today, to look at subsector changes. And so it's not just changes in leisure and hospitality, it's a lot of redistribution and reorganization within these specific sectors and even within these specific subsectors. And often these changes are so granular that it's almost impossible to pick up with the data that we have available. It's hard to see workers transitioning from working in a grocery store as a cashier to working in a grocery store as an Instacart shopper. So they're in the same place of employment, but the parameters of their job have changed quite heavily. And we often don't record those really minute changes that are having really big effect. The other element that it depends on is region. And so obviously we all know that the country is very diverse and there's a lot of different, sectors that are prominent in different areas of the country. So given my home institution and I think hopefully the interests of all of you, today is going to just focus for the most part on Ohio. Ohio is unique in that it often is used as a representative market for product development or product rollout. And so in some cases, it is possible to use the national trends and say what's happening nationally is probably going to be mirrored in Ohio. But to whatever extent possible today, I'd like to present data specifically on changes in Ohio, and then when needed, supplementing that with data that's only collected nationally to give us a bigger picture look. So now that you have a sense of where we are going for this talk, I'm going to start off by presenting first. We're going to start at the top of the value chain, food and ag value chain, with farm workers. So I'm going to, in one moment, put up a graph of employment of farm workers in Ohio over the last 7 or so years, with a couple of caveats. So as that pops up and you can take a look, you can see, first of all, the first thing that you're going to want to note is that farm worker employment is incredibly low in Ohio. This is true for a variety of reasons. Of course, the farm worker population is difficult to survey. It's often the sector relies on migrant workers or undocumented workers who are not always going to be captured in these employment surveys. And so this very low number of about not even 4,000 workers is quite low. And especially later on in the next couple slides, when I present food processing workers and food service workers, this number is going to seem incredibly small. But with that caveat in mind, we can look at over the last 5 years or so, we had been trending up in the number of farm workers. The growth was relatively small. If we look at, we started sort of bottomed out in 2016 with around less than 3,000 farm workers. That was on a rather steep upward trend towards 4,000 when the pandemic hit. And ultimately what that resulted in was an 8% decline during 2020. And so farm worker employment is probably the most difficult to predict, because in reality, this subsector of the ag value chain has been dealing with labor shortages for a long time. And so this COVID, the changes brought about by COVID are really nothing new, and really something that the industry has sort of learned to expect. And it's almost as if now farm operators can hear the, trials and tribulations of food processing managers and food service managers and say, oh, you have labor shortages? Welcome to my world. Because this is really farm labor has been an ongoing issue with a lot of open questions about how it's going to be solved. And so this 8% decline looks somewhat dramatic, but in reality, in my opinion, it's not something that the industry hasn't weathered before and has continued to grapple with and will continue to grapple with, as really right now shows no signs of getting better. It's a different sort of story when we move. So now we're going to move one step farther down the value chain, closer to the consumer, and look at employment trends in food processing. The data here are a little bit more rich, meaning that we have monthly data going back to 1990. And so we get a sort of a clearer picture of what's been happening over time in terms of the amount of workers. And so when I pop that up on the screen, the first thing I'm going to point out is that the number of workers is an order of magnitude greater than the number of workers who are working on farm. And so we see in the tens of thousands in Ohio, workers working in food manufacturing. The other thing that's hopefully quite obvious to all of you looking is that employment in food processing is quite cyclical. And so we see periods of decline and periods of growth over time. And so, of course, there's also a lot of within year. So if you look at just one individual year, we see quite a bit of variation that seems to peak right around the summer and then drops off as the year comes to a close. And so we see both within year and over year variation in employment in food processing. Of course, I hopefully don't have to say what this really drastic spike is right here. That, of course, is April 2020. That is COVID, the month after the pandemic was declared. Food processing did experience a sharp decline in employment. That was represented a 5% loss from March 2020 to April 2020. This, as you can see really clearly on this graph, was actually made up for in the next 2 months almost immediately. So we saw a 2% gain in employment from April to May, and then another 2% gain from May to June, putting the current level of employment in food processing sort of right where we would expect on this downward, but again, expected and sort of cyclical trend that has been observed over the last 30 years as well. So this is not really a change that we see as being knocked off a path. It did temporarily, but the industry was, to some extent at least, able to recover and is still going to be experiencing those within year changes, but there's really no evidence to suggest that this industry, this sub-industry, I should say, is experiencing any sort of abnormal employment changes. Last but not least, this is obviously the sector that is closest to consumers and thus took the biggest hit in terms of employment. It's also the one that's most salient to all of us. I think all can think of an experience we've had where we've gone to our favorite restaurant or even our not so favorite restaurant and just wanted a quick meal and saw either reduced hours, short staff, closure entirely. The sort of responses are sort of ranging across the board, but the reality is that yes, food service, as we get closer to the consumer, the sector is experiencing more and more churn and disruption in the employment trend. And so this is a quite a dramatic picture, really captures the actual really significant loss to this sector of the economy in Ohio. Of course, the data, it lumps accommodation in there as well, and so it's not entirely food service driven, but we can imagine that it, for the most part, really is. And so, yes, this decline from March to April was extremely large, complete knockoff of the trend that we had been seeing before. There was some recovery, of course, almost immediately as we started to learn how to deal with the pandemic, and restaurants and other food service operations learned to reorient themselves. But the reality is that we are still, at our most recent data available, have 50,000 fewer workers than we did at the start of the pandemic. This is equivalent to about 11% of the pre-pandemic workforce. And so we're still missing about 10% of where we had been prior to the declaration of the pandemic. Of course, as we get closer to the consumer and as we move down the value chain, you can see now that we are in the hundreds of thousands in terms of number of employees. And so in order of magnitude, even larger than food processing, and then 2 orders of magnitude larger than workers on farm. Where this trend is going, the recovery trajectory is obviously going to be quite long, and it's unclear if we are ever going to get back. Although this does seem like a steep growth, recently it seemed to have leveled off a bit as well, meaning that it's unclear how long it will take to get us back to where we had been prior to the start of the pandemic. This is especially true when we think about all of the reorganizations and changes that have gone on in this industry as businesses have learned and adapted to some extent to what consumers are now demanding. Consumers are now demanding much more curbside pickup style or takeout style, which is less labor intensive. And so for that, we may see fewer workers in this sector overall going forward. And so it's really going to continue to be an area where there are struggles, especially as, and I'll talk about these factors a little bit later, as there are growth in outside opportunities that are simply more appealing than your traditional food service job. And so, as I said throughout the talk, this is a 13% decline in employment just from this pre-pandemic period to the present. Doesn't even take into account this really significant loss in employment that occurred immediately as the pandemic was declared. One thing that I always like to do in my short time in Ohio, I've learned that the state is actually, it's quite diverse. It is not just the image in people's minds of Ohio is a corn and soybean, very traditional ag state, but that's, of course, we all know, not reality. So I always like to present, when possible, employment trends or any sort of trends at the county level. And fortunately, we do have some data that enable us to do that. And so what I've got here is, of course, as you get smaller geography-wise, you're going to get bigger industry-wise. And so this is just looking at the leisure employment change, but it's looking at individual counties in particular. And so you will forgive me, Ian didn't mention, but my undergrad, my alma mater is University of Illinois. So I had to put some orange and blue on my slides. It doesn't go too well with the scarlet and gray, but you will indulge me for just this little bit. But what we're looking at here is that this is showing actually there are some counties in the state that over the year from March 2020 to March 2021, which is the most recent data available, did actually experience growth in leisure employment. Some of those should be kind of obvious for why that occurred, with big tourist attractions in their county. And this is, of course, probably taking into account some high summer demand that sort of hadn't tapered off yet by March. But overall, the picture is pretty pretty grim in terms of most counties in the state experiencing really significant declines in employment in leisure and hospitality. And so if your county happens to be one of the blue ones, that's a sign of hope. But the reality is that much of the state, particularly around our major urban centers, is experiencing significant declines in this larger sector. Of course, we also can't look at food manufacturing in particular. And so this is going to be all manufacturing, not just food processing, but I still think it's important to show. Once again, blue shows an increase, and this is a year change from March 2020 to March 2021. We see a somewhat different story. This sort of belt of counties right to the south of Columbus have all experienced positive changes in employment manufacturing from March 2020 to March 2021. Data don't allow us to say what's happened since, but again, showing that a slightly rosier picture, although the percent changes are lower overall, a slightly rosier picture in terms of which counties are doing okay as a result of not as a result of the pandemic, following the pandemic, and which counties are still struggling. And so hopefully you enjoy, if you're from Ohio, you can see your county here and think about if this matches up with your experience as we move forward in our talk. So the next area that I'd like to cover really kind of a little bit quickly, but I think is important, is looking at workforce composition. The big question that everyone seems to have is, where are the workers? Who are they? What are they doing instead of working? And one way we can do that is looking at the age composition of the workforce in these specific subsectors. Now, the data I'm going to present here are national, meaning that's not in Ohio. This is a little too detailed to be at the state level, but I think it points to some really important long-term changes that that the industry needs to be prepared for and reckon with. And so when we look by age at Americans employed in food processing, we see, of course, in 2020, the overall number of workers declined. And of course, these age bands, just to be a little bit confusing, we have youngest workers, the youngest age category. These are, you can think of as high school aged workers at the top. And then at the bottom, we have the oldest workers who are 65 and older. And what you should be taking away from this, I know it is a little bit busy, is that every age category experienced decreases across the board. So up until we get down to this oldest age group, we see, in fact, in 2020, the year of the pandemic, the percent of workers working in food processing who were older than 65 significantly increased by 14%. What does this say? This says that the long-term projections seem to indicate an aging workforce in food processing. Does this translate to productivity declines? That, of course, remains to be seen, but it is something that the industry will have to contend with and should be taking on board more and more. This sort of finding isn't that surprising. The Bureau of Labor Statistics recently published a report that said the number of employed people who are 75 and older, so 10 years older than represented on this graph, will almost double over the next year. And so, over the next 10 years. So an almost 100% increase in the employment rate of people 75 and older. What this is driven by, of course, is probably low savings levels among these individuals, a sort of shaky retirement system. Whatever the case may be, we are seeing an aging workforce sort of permeating throughout this sector in particular, especially as younger people, and especially in these two youngest age groups, find employment elsewhere, and for a variety of reasons. Now, when we switch gears and look at food service typically has been dominated by younger employees. So once again, youngest employees are at the top, and oldest are at the bottom. And here we actually see somewhat of an opposite story. We see the smallest percent decrease in the year 2020 from 2019 was among this youngest age group. And so we see that only 6% fewer, it did decline, but it is the smallest percent decline in this age group. 6% fewer employees in this youngest age group in food service. But every category, every age category did experience significant declines. And you can see overall, the number is much, much lower. One thing that is going to sort of preview what I will be talking about in a little bit is that the largest decline came from this category here. So this is, I'm sorry, this light blue category here, 25 to 34 years of age, saw the largest, almost a 25% less workers in this age category in food service. Who are these workers? They're 25 to 34 years of age. Statistically, they are most likely to be the people who have young children at home. And so this, I think, sort of belies something that we all have learned to contend with and learned to recognize over the course of the pandemic. And my colleague Zoe mentioned this as well, that constraints on home work that you do at home, whether that's childcare, elder care, healthcare, have really changed the ways in which people engage with the labor force. And we're seeing that particularly when we look at food service workers from 2019 to 2020. Not slowing down at all. I'm going to push right on and go ahead and share some changes in unemployment rates over time. And so we're going to start by looking at the unemployment rate in Ohio. Of course, once again, I don't have to ask what this spike is. This is, of course, April 2020. The pandemic saw a significant spike in unemployment, which makes our current level of 5.4% unemployment seem relatively low in comparison, and does show that we, as a state, recovered pretty significantly from this high point, really extreme high point during the height of the pandemic, or the initial period of the pandemic. We do see some evidence now in the last couple months that the unemployment rate has started to tick back up. The most recent 2 months available show that this is leveling off, so it's not clear that this is going to continue to grow and grow and grow, but it does show that we didn't continue to resume the trend that we had been on really since data collection, the data I'm presenting began, which is a sort of overall downward trend in the unemployment rate. So we didn't resume that trend, but we did. So we are seeing some churn, and it's possible that a lot of this rebound in the unemployment rate is churn as employees came back to jobs or came back from being remote or whatever the case may be. We saw and we continue to see a lot of dissatisfaction with their job. So maybe COVID has allowed them to orient themselves around their priorities. It's allowed them to change what they value. And so they came back to their jobs, found it wasn't what they wanted, and then subsequently quit. And so we saw the unemployment rate tick back up. Will this eventually settle out and start to decline? Yes, as this sort of churn, this matching process between workers and jobs continues to play out, eventually workers and jobs match up and people find jobs that they like, they find jobs that they are able to do and do them well, and then we'll see the unemployment rate stabilize after that. But we are in a period right now of great churn. It is interesting. I like to think about the last time employment in Ohio was this level, so 5.4%. If we draw a line across, doesn't quite line up on this little figure, but the last time unemployment was at this level was October 2014. Of course, conditions were very different then. That was a rate of 5.4 in a period of prolonged decline in the unemployment rate. I said at the beginning that we can often use Ohio as our sort of national bellwether. It's something we hear quite a bit. So it's interesting, just really briefly, to look at how the unemployment rate in Ohio compares to the national one. And we see, so Ohio is of course in this beautiful scarlet color. We see the national unemployment rate never got quite as high as it did in Ohio. But that sort of trend has switched, and now we actually see that Ohio's, for the first couple months of 2021, actually had an unemployment rate that was tracking lower than the national unemployment rate. Although now, as we have that little uptick, we're starting to see maybe the opposite trend emerging. But overall, throughout the pandemic, or prior to the pandemic, the maxim that Ohio tracks the national averages pretty well did seem to hold. Obviously, in the national rate, there's much more within year variation, and Ohio's is much smoother. But for the most part, we do see the state following national trends. Another interesting way to explore the unemployment rate in Ohio is looking at the individual counties, but instead of looking at every county on one graph, which would be a little messy, a little bit like spaghetti, what I'm going to present here are counties by metro adjacency. So we can think of there being three kinds of counties in Ohio. We have metro counties, so you think of our urban counties. We have non-metro counties that are adjacent to a metro county, and then finally our rural or non-metro counties that are not adjacent to a metro county. And so when we plot the unemployment rate of these, it's often, I think, the tendency to think of this unemployment situation as being an urban problem. But when we put this plot up, what really should be apparent is that the unemployment in metro counties is actually the lowest, or had been up until the start of the recovery from the pandemic. And so we start to see the metro counties make a quick jump and catch up with the other two categories. But until that point, unemployment had really been driven in particular by the counties that are bordering our metro counties. But it is important just to sort of hammer home that this is a problem that rural counties are contending with and will continue to contend with as the labor market changes. This is just another way of sort of presenting the same information. Just instead of putting our counties into three different categories, we can sort of break them up into large, medium, and small, urban and rural counties. So this is as close to spaghetti as I will be presenting, but really what this shows is that unemployment in our largest metro counties was the lowest over time, and unemployment for the most part, in our medium-sized rural or non-metro counties had been the highest up until the pandemic, when everything started to sort of converge and unemployment rates seem to be now all trending together and approaching the same level, with a little bit of evidence to suggest that our smallest cities or smallest metro counties are starting to pull away and really start to increase their unemployment dramatically. And so I won't linger too long here. I'm already very tight on time. And so just another interesting way to think about the unemployment rate. So I'm going to skip over presenting unemployment by industry. Unsurprisingly, it's dominated by leisure and hospitality, and then non-durable goods is as close to food manufacturing as we can get with the data, and we see that that's actually tracking a little bit below the all industries unemployment rate. So the question on the forefront of everyone's mind is, of course, where are the workers? And to the best of my ability, I'm going to try and give some insights on that. The first thing, and I think the most important thing to remember, is that the labor force available, in particular to the food and agricultural sector, is smaller overall. One of the reasons for that trend is that the COVID-related morbidity or COVID-related deaths or significant harm was not distributed equally among sectors. Really interesting work coming out of the University of San Francisco shows, and I know this is a little overwhelming of a figure, but the thing to take away is that each of these were considered the quote unquote essential workforce, the essential industries. Even amongst these essential industries, the morbidity rate was not equal. What the reality is that right here we have food and agriculture had the highest COVID-related morbidity amongst essential workers, even higher than those working in the health industry in particular. And so what these authors found, of course, this is for Californians, but I think the same logic applies nationwide. They found a 39% higher mortality in this industry in particular relative to pre-pandemic times. And so the labor force in this industry is smaller than it had been, and it was smaller than it was smaller than it will be for other of these essential industries, and especially smaller than the change in the workforce for non-essential industries. We're also seeing visa workers. The sector relies heavily, of course, on H-2A and H-2B visa workers. We could talk at length about the shortcomings of that program, those programs, and their insufficiency in meeting needs. But the reality is that these workers often work in H-2A workers, of course, work in agriculture. H-2B workers often work in food processing or food service, but we see significantly fewer H-2A to the tune of 75% fewer workers in 2021 versus Q1 of 2020. And so this trend has continued to decline, and these workers are simply not as available as they once were, whether that's due to COVID-related uncertainty, increased opportunities in their home countries, whatever the case may be, the number of workers coming to Ohio in particular is down quite significantly. This is true for H-2B food service workers as well. This is a 17% decline, and a trend that does not seem to be changing as we move into the future. And so here is one place where Ohio in particular does not track the national average at all. And so we can think about different reasons why. We can think about there being these factors that push people out of these jobs in this sector. And those include increased on-job risk. And this, of course, risk increases as we move down the value chain. And so as people experience more risk on their job, their expectations of being compensated for that risk are going to increase. There's, of course, particular risk of customer-facing jobs. In addition, the job requirements and the policies of a job have changed. So I mentioned that people are coming back to work and finding that the job isn't like it used to be. In some cases in this sector, that might mean that they're now required to enforce policies of their parent company or policies of the government related to mask mandates and things like that. This is obviously going to be a changing job requirement. This is, you've heard the expression above my pay grade. A lot of people are finding that this in particular is above their pay grade. And of course, staffing issues have a negative feedback loop. As people deal with negative customer interactions, those are getting worse as staffing issues get worse. And so it creates this sort of churn that pushes people out of this industry more and more. At the same time, we can think of there being pull factors. So factors in other industries or other time uses that are pulling people away from food and agriculture. I already mentioned the increased at-home workload, the increased cost of childcare, healthcare across the board. And those industries are also experiencing staffing shortages. And so this sort of ripple effect is only making the value of time at home higher. If you're going to have to pay more for childcare, it makes more sense to just stay at home. Another thing, and this is getting, I think, increasing attention, which is really quite exciting, is that workers are now valuing job flexibility much more. So when we think about the compensation package for a worker, we think about there being one thing that's really, really important is the wage, of course. The wage is the fundamental thing that determines how much a worker likes a job. But these other factors are mattering much, much more. And job flexibility is one that has changed significantly in terms of how much workers value it as a result of the pandemic. And so people are seeing these outside opportunities to work in the gig economy, what have you. Those jobs offer great deals of flexibility. Zoe had a really great example of working 2-hour shifts in customer service. that kind of thing is difficult to enact in the food and ag sector. You have to be at a place to serve people food. You have to be harvesting at a specific time, whatever the case may be. Flexibility is one thing that it's going to be difficult for this sector to compromise on. And so we think about these non-wage factors and outside opportunities for flexible work, pulling people out of the market. So I talked about wage, I talked about there being wage competition amongst industries. And so I think it's important if we look really, really quickly at sector level wages in Ohio. So because the data are really quite lumpy, so we can't look at specific subsectors, we do see the service wage, average hourly wage in service in Ohio, much higher than the manufacturing wage. So it doesn't necessarily, when we look at this data, seem like it's higher wages pulling people out of these food service or into food processing jobs. When we look nationally, we can look at even more specific subsectors, and this is where we start to see some of the differences. So if we think about non-durable goods manufacturing as being a close approximation of food manufacturing, we see that the wage in food service is still about $5 below a non-durable goods manufacturing job. This changed post-pandemic. However, you can see that this slope of this wage increase, of this wage over time, is significantly different than the sort of gradual change we'd been experiencing from 2010 up till the start of the pandemic. Now, wages in this sector are sort of rapidly increasing, and it doesn't really show any signs of slowing down as workers continue to bargaining power and demand for labor, increases. This seems to be a trend that's not going away. I'm going to skip over looking at the sector level wages by county to look instead at farm wages by job type. And so this is on-farm work for farm workers in particular. And so we have three categories of worker. We have equipment operators, who we would think of as being the most quote unquote skilled labor. And so their wage does seem to reflect that. And then we also have hourly wage for crop and livestock workers. And so, as I think I heard in the comments in Zoe's talk, it's not the wage that's not putting people in work in agriculture, because this wage is tracking right along with food service or even most manufacturing jobs in Ohio. So this wage of about $15 an hour, or even about up to 20 if you're an equipment operator, is not quite not the only thing keeping people from working in this sector. What are we seeing in terms of trend? It's no surprise, input costs are going up, and to the extent that labor has always been in somewhat of a shortage, wages are going to continue to be pushed up by those shortages as people, operators in particular, try and encourage people to work on their operations. Wage is one of the ways in which that can be done. I find it instructive to compare Ohio's average wage with the national wage for these sort of specific occupations. And we see that for the farm workers in crop or livestock, you match the color to the sort of lighter color for the national average. So the dark blue is Ohio and the light blue is national. We see that for these farm workers, Ohio is pretty close to the national wage rate. One place in where Ohio is tracking quite a bit above the national wage rate is for these equipment operators. And so there is important distinctions, even when you look within a sector, within specific job categories, about the cost of these different employees. And Ohio seems to be doing quite well nationally. So just to give a couple brief conclusions, I know I'm already 2 minutes over my time, for which I do apologize. Zoe mentioned this as well, but increasing labor demand is increasing worker bargaining power. And so we can think of people who are demanding and supplying labor at a stalemate. And really now the sort of question is, who can outlast who? How long can those who need workers go without having them, and how long can workers go without earning a stable wage? One of the things that does tend to get a lot of attention and gets a lot of hype is unemployment benefits. And the reality is that unemployment benefits play a really, actually, when you look empirically, quite a small role in the decision to remain unemployed. So when we saw these pandemic-related unemployment benefits go away, half the states in the country ended them early. That allowed us to really examine whether or not they had any effect on the unemployment rate. And so far, the evidence has been that they really didn't move the unemployment rate very much. So you would think that if people were remaining unemployed for the benefits, that when those benefits went away, they'd come back to work, but that's really not what we had been seeing. And so that's going to be continued to be an area to look at. But for now, the reality is much more so that there are factors of the job in particular that are drawing people to the job, and understanding what those factors are and understanding how you as an operator or manager can alter those factors is crucially important. And so it's not just wage, and it's in reality much more about the intangible qualities of the job related to its flexibility, related to the company culture, related to the workplace culture, that are having a much bigger impact than they ever had before. And I think we do have COVID to thank for that, allowing people to reevaluate what they prioritize and what they value. So I have burned up most of my time, and so I cannot give a quick look at the labor policy. What I was going to do was run through the details of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which was passed in the House and is currently being read in committee in the Senate. It's got two major components: creation of a special immigrant status for certified agricultural workers, something that has been long needed and long debated on sort of both sides of the aisle. It also changes H-2A. My opinion is that these changes are probably insufficient and do have some areas of increased burden for operators in particular. But the reality is, like most legislation, it is definitely a compromise, and no one really seems to be happy with it. It's sort of a half step in the right direction, but it's unclear if it goes far enough. And I can talk through the details maybe later on, or if someone has a question about it, I'd be happy to run through those at the end. And I will just conclude by saying that the labor supply issues are really, really quite pervasive now. It's easy to describe what's going on. It's even more difficult to have answers. But the reality is now that people who are supplying jobs, who are looking for workers, need to market themselves just as much now as workers used to market themselves to employers. And that's a difficult thing to recognize in some ways, but the reality is that sort of as labor demand increases and people's valuation for different aspects of a job change, employers do need to have some recognition of that and sort of meet their workers where they want to be met in some situations. All right. Thank you all very much. I'm happy to be contacted via email or phone, and looking forward to your questions.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
There were lots of more interesting, additionally interesting things that you had in those last few slides, but I'm sure people appreciate that there's a lot going on here that maybe 10 years ago people weren't talking about like they are now. I think, suddenly labor economists have never been underemployed, but now they definitely had a lot to be thinking about. So we have a question in the question and answer. We had a question earlier, which was just simply, will the slides be available after the presentation? And let me see who, that was from Jordan Beck. Yeah, Jordan, they'll be available on the webpage. And if you wanted to email Margaret directly, I'm sure she'd be very happy to send you those slides. So the question we have right now, we have two now. Gosh, I know both these guys. First of all, from Jackie Fatka. Margaret, you met Jackie out at the Farm Science Review, if you don't remember. So her question is, how much of the lower unemployment rate is attributed to people not returning to or permanently exiting the workforce?
That is a really good question, and it's one that's difficult to capture at the state level, but estimates at the national level have gone up as high as half of the unemployment rate, the change in the unemployment rate, I should say, half of the change from where we would have been if COVID hadn't happened, which is of course somewhat difficult to estimate compared to where we are now. Estimates have said up to half of that change is due to people who no longer wish to be employed or are remaining at home, maybe to deal with childcare or elder care or something like that. But the reality is that is a significant portion. So hard to say at an Ohio level where that is, and the data are still sort of coming out on that, allowing us to get better estimates. But it's a huge component of the unemployment rate. Of course, the unemployment rate does not take into account those who have permanently left the workforce or who are no longer looking for jobs. And so to some extent, they are not being captured by the unemployment rate to the extent that it's only looking at people who are actively seeking a job. And so some of the loss in the workforce is people who are unemployed and some who have exited the labor market.
Okay, we have this is a follow-up question from Amanda to read us. Hi, Amanda. I think I taught Amanda as a graduate student and an undergraduate student, so it's great to hear from Amanda. So how are so many people affording to leave the workforce? And I think this is a question many of us economists have right now. So what do you think of that question? How would you answer that?
I mean, again, it's a great question. A lot of it is people have either shifted priorities and shifted what their family is able to live off of, and so they're living with a smaller budget. There are also evidence to show that savings rates over the pandemic increased significantly. People were not spending money at the same rate they were, and so everyone sort of has a little bit larger of a nest egg that they can live off of, at least temporarily, while they search for work. And so this idea of a stalemate that I sort of brought up at the end kind of comes down to how long can people live off of that COVID-related nest egg, the savings that they built up during the time when they weren't spending as much money. How long can they afford to live off of that while they subsidize their search for the job that they're going to actually want to stay in and want to perform in well? And that is a place as well where unemployment benefits do play a role. So we often think of unemployment benefits not necessarily as disincentivizing work, but instead subsidizing that search. They provide that sort of cushion that allow people to continue searching. And of course, there is always going to be the people who game the system, but the reality is that is lower than you would expect. I know it's a sort of a hard thing to grapple with, and it's somewhat uncomfortable to talk about, but the reality is that they play a role, but the role they play is smaller than people tend to imagine.
It's interesting, macroeconomists have been tracking savings rates here in the US since the financial crisis, and we know that savings rates, the US basically had negative rates of savings prior to the financial crisis. And we know we're very high rates of consumption relative to GDP. But after the financial crisis, we saw US savings rates sort of moving back towards what they were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's going to be very interesting to see whether these are permanent shifts in savings now post-pandemic. As I don't expect you to necessarily know what's going to happen there, but I think it is interesting to keep an eye on that. So we have another question in the box. So this is from Chris Soller. Hi, Chris, how are you? Chris is from OSU Extension. It's more than just a wage that attracts and keeps people. How do you suggest farm employers approach successfully recruiting and retaining employees?
That's a great question, Chris. And this is actually a topic Chris and I have talked about a lot together. And so I'm glad you're allowing me to spotlight some of the initial stuff that we've talked about and thought about. One of the ways in which farm operators in particular can attract workers is identifying what makes their operation a good place to work, and understanding what I was saying at the end there about intangibles is really, really important. These sort of things that it's difficult to quantify, but it's related to the kind of manager you are, the level of trust you have in your employees. And that's always, trust is a hard thing to have in any relationship, but especially in an employer-employee relationship. But the studies have shown that trust is one of the when an employee feels like they are trusted on their job and not being treated sort of as like a someone who, you're always being looked at with suspicion or what have you, the value they have for that job is much higher. And so those sorts of company culture related things that are difficult to evaluate and difficult to change are growing more and more important. And it's sort of a hard answer. It's a good answer in one way because it doesn't necessarily mean more money being spent on your labor, but it is a hard answer because it requires a bit of introspection on the part of employers.
So we have another question here. The questions keep coming in, so keep them going. We can take another five up to 10 minutes maybe. Before.
That's fine. I went long.
Some of us will need another cup of coffee and something to eat at some point. But here's a question from Mark Lensman. Thanks, Mark, for the question. Oh, this sounds like a question about me, not me personally. But aren't the baby boomers, of which I am one, they're exiting the workforce at a more rapid rate than the youngest two gens are replacing them? Is this an issue in the ag sector as well? Also, is the type of job that baby boomers are leaving not attractive to Gen Z, etc., due to tech and higher educational resources?
Yes. Yeah. The short answer is that there are, as I was pointing out when I was talking about the food processing jobs, generational changes are really quite dramatic, and the sort of if we could speak broadly about the differences in the generations, the things that baby boomers value are different than the things that certainly millennials and even more certainly Gen Z value. And so an example I like to think of is loyalty to a job, or having this idea of being loyal to your employer is something that I think on average a baby boomer would value quite highly. I like to think of my own situation. My dad worked for the same company his entire life. My sister, who's in the same industry, has had 3 different employers, in 10 years. And so it's hard to reconcile those two things when often it is a baby boomer or someone in those older generations in a manager role, and then the employees are, that sort of intergenerational understanding is also going to contribute to some of the employer-employee mismatch that we've been seeing. But yes, the reality is that boomers are leaving faster than they are being replaced, and the sectors that they're going into, the appeal of working in a food processing job, in reality, it's a hard industry to work in. I think my colleague Zoe made the same point. It's a hard industry to work in regardless of where you are along the value chain, and it's going to be difficult to find people to replace these workers who are leaving.
So we don't have any more questions in the box right now, so I'm going to take chairperson's prerogative and ask the difficult question for you that Zoe had a difficult one, and you can ask me a difficult one later too.
Okay.
You have that opportunity to
just remember, yeah, you're gonna it's gonna come back to you.
You live by the sword, you die by the sword, right?
Right.
So, and this is sort of more of a macro question, but I'm trying to tie together some of the things that Zoe talked about, and so we know that until very recently we've had very little experience of inflation. That since the great inflation that ended in the 1980s with the Fed switching to a more targeted interest rate policy, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the arguments I'm reading in the macro literature is that people had low inflation expectations, and now those inflation expectations are changing, and we have a very sharp increase in prices, particularly in food prices. Zoe was talking about meatflation last week at the US Farm Report interview. So, but if you read, just read Paul Krugman's columns, he was a macroeconomist as well as a trade economist before he became a New York Times columnist. His argument is we've had a big price rises because we went from a low base because of the way we're measuring inflation. But there's a lot of concern out there about the rate at which inflation is increasing. So tying it back into wages, do you think we're going to go back to an era like we had certainly in Europe in the 70s of wage push inflation, given given this description you had of the current labor market?
I think, you know, Zoe used the phrase perfect storm, and I think I'll borrow it. I do think so. I think we are experiencing enough of a sort of change in the balance of power between labor demand and labor supply that that imbalance itself will contribute to pushing wages up. The increase in inflation only provides, and the increase in prices as well, only provides the perfect sort of explanation, the perfect foil on which these workers can demand higher wages. And so I think those two things together, if we had just one or the other, I think they might be necessary but not sufficient. But because we have both, I think we are going to start to see that sort of growth in wages pegged by inflation.
So do you see the Federal Reserve jumping in pretty soon to try to dampen down inflation expectations?
I wouldn't be surprised if they did. So I'm going to cautiously say yes, but with the economist's caveat that you know, it depends, or whatever the case may be. But yeah, I imagine the pressure will be there to keep the rate low.
But they've certainly signaled that they're probably going to increase rates next year. Yeah. It's just by how many times. Certainly in other countries, their equivalents to the Federal Reserve. I noticed the Bank of England is very worried about the same sort of problem, exacerbated by Brexit, of course. Okay, just one very quick question from Jackie, and then I think I will call proceedings to a halt for today. So Jackie, again, she asks, well, she says, we all have this money now approved. We have all this money now approved in the infrastructure bill, but will we have enough people willing to take those jobs? So like, essentially, who will build the bridges and make improvements to the ports that are important for the agricultural sector?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and if I knew, I think I'd have a great job in labor force consulting. But the reality is that a lot of that funding is going to have to go towards increased wages in those sectors, and ideally, hopefully, continued changes to the visa workforce population, continued flexibility there. We started to see some more and more flexibility in these visa programs with the pandemic, and hopefully the recognition that sort of, we talk about just-in-time, the just-in-time employment is going to be even more crucial now that we have huge demands for this sort of manual or construction labor as a result of the infrastructure bill. But yeah, if I knew who was going to do it, I'd call them up and tell them to. But it's hard to know specifically. Okay,
so I guess Jackie had the last hard question. So I'm going to bring the session to a close, and I'd like to thank again Margaret very much for a really interesting deep dive into these important employment issues.